In this video, I want to introduce some ideas in CSS related to the layout and spacing of a website. So one important distinction we can make in CSS and HTML is between inline and block elements. So we'll make an H1 tag here and we'll make a link tag here. I just want to show you the difference between these two when we actually use some CSS to give them a background color. So I'll give some CSS here and I'll give each one a background color. So I'll say H1 background color red, and then I'll say link background color pink. And we get this here. And you see that there's a difference. And that's because the H1 element is a block element. The link element is an inline element. And a block level element will always start on a new line and take up the full width available, basically stretching out to the right and left as far as it can. Whereas an inline element doesn't start on a new line and it only takes up as much width as necessary. So that's why we get that difference there in behavior. Two common elements you see in website layouts are div and span. And div is kind of like a generic block element, whereas span is kind of like a generic inline element. So div looks like this. We'll just say here div ID section, and then we'll say like H2 and we'll say content, and then we'll do a paragraph in here and we'll say some content. And span looks like this. We'll say span ID content, some content. And unless we really style them with CSS, they don't really have any effect on anything. They're, like I said, kind of generic, and they're intended to be used with styles and CSS of some kind. So here I'm going to say pound section, and I'll give it a background color just so we can see what's going to happen. And we'll do the same thing with content. And you'll see we get this, very much the same as before. Now, one thing I can do with a block level element by default that I can't do with an inline element is change the width of it. So if I were to say here width 200 pixels for this section, and same thing, width 200 pixels for the inline element, I get a different behavior here. I can actually change the width of the div and the block element, but I can't with the span and the inline element. So setting the widths of divs and other elements is actually one of the ways that website layouts are achieved, and typically in conjunction with other properties as well. So there's another CSS property called float, where we can say float left or float right, and it'll make images and other things float to the left or the right within their containing element. In other words, whatever parent element they're inside, and then other things will kind of float around them. And so one thing I could do with this website I've got here is, let's actually, instead of having just section and that span here, let's have section and then sidebar. I'll say sidebar, and I'll say H2 sidebar. And I'll just have some more content here. And then what I'm going to do is, instead of modifying content, I'm going to modify sidebar. I'll keep background color background color pink, but for my width, I'm going to say 25%. For my width of the section, I'm going to say 75%. And what this means now is take up 75% of your containing element, take up 25% of your containing element. Their containing element in this case is body. And then I'll say float left and float left. And what this does altogether is they're both going to take up 75% and 25% of their containing element, which is the body itself. And if I move things around, they continue to take up 75% and 25%. And because they're both floating left, we get this behavior of them being kind of stacked next to each other. If I didn't have that float in there, then we get something like this, where it takes up 75% and 25%. But because I say float left and float left, they end up both trying to float to the left. They end up taking 100% of the screen, and they end up being right next to each other, both floating left together. So that's kind of actually how some website layouts are constructed in terms of the absolute basics of how it works. So on W3 Schools, they have this example of a responsive web layout here, where they've got like a content pane here and then a sidebar here. And if you go to try it yourself, you can play around with it pretty well. And it's essentially the same idea of floating to the left, setting a width, floating to the left, setting a width. There's a little more to it than that in terms of spacing and that, but that's the core of how this type of website layout is achieved. So now that we're changing the width of things and floating them and so forth, one of the other things we want to start doing is adding margins, borders, and paddings to things. And CSS follows this box model here, where you've got this idea of the content followed by padding, followed by a border, followed by a margin. And it's easier if I just kind of show you how it works. So I'm just going to say here, div ID or div class content. And then I'll say some content here. And we'll just set it up here, and we'll just say background color aqua to start, and we'll give it a width. We'll just say 100 pixels. This time though, we'll also give it a height so we can see it with a height. So now I'll get this kind of box looking thing here with a width of 100 pixels and height of 100 pixels. Now, if I want to add in, say, padding, I can say here, padding 20 pixels. And you'll see this. You'll see that the content now has this 20 pixels of padding. And that's this space here. The padding kind of goes between the content and anything else outside of it. I could also add in a border. So I could say here, border 4 pixels, solid black. And now I've got a 4 pixel solid black border around it. And again, that's this layer on the box model there, the border. Now for the margin, just so we can see it, I'm just going to throw in some p tags around this div just so we can kind of see how it works better. So I'll just say some text over here, some text over there, and then we'll just throw in a margin. So I'll say here margin 40 pixels. And also I'll throw in a background color on the body itself too. I'll just say background color of pink, just that way I can actually see the margin here. So I do a refresh here, and you'll see I've got about 40 pixels, 40 pixels, 40 pixels. So it's throwing this 40 pixel margin all the way around things now. And you can actually get into individual things here where you can say, like, let's just say I want it to be like 10 pixels on the top, and then I believe it's 20 pixels to the right, and then we'll say like 70 pixels on the bottom, and then on the left we'll say 20 pixels. You can do that, and now you're individually setting the properties. So it's 10 pixels up here, 70 pixels down here, and then 20 pixels to the left and to the right. And if you want to figure out how to do that, just go to the reference and you can go through and figure out how to exactly specify different things, but you've got that level of granularity to control things as well. So, okay, so that's the box model. So one of the more modern ways of implementing website layouts is to use what's called the Flexbox container. So Flexbox works like this. I'm going to say here, div class container, close that, and I put some panels inside of it. So I'll say div class panel, and I'll say some content here, and then I'll do another one. So div class panel, and I'll put some content here. Now the way Flexbox works is like this. I'm going to say here that a panel is going to have a width of 50 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, and background color, we'll make it aqua, and then margin 10 pixels and padding 10 pixels. So we're gonna have some kind of box things in there. And then our containers are gonna look like this. Containers are gonna say background color, pink, and we're gonna say here width 300 pixels. Now by default, it's gonna look like this. But with a Flexbox container, we're going to get this look to things. And I can actually then choose how I want to line the elements up inside of it. So I can actually say flex direction, column. So let's say on a mobile device, I want things to stack. I can get it to look like that. And this is another sort of key tool for building website layouts. And it's possible to make the same sort of layouts with like sidebars and content and so forth using flex. And it's very similar kind of a thing where you say display flex, and you can give things percentages and so forth, and you get that kind of a nice looking website layout. So then one last thing regarding layouts, if you look at the W3 Schools examples here, they actually use like divs here to define different sections of the page, like the navigation bar here, you can see is defined using a div there. Now you can do that, and that is like okay, and that's very common to see, but there's something called semantic elements. And the idea with these is that you actually have elements called header for the header, nav for the nav, footer for the footer, section, article, aside, etc. And the idea here is that you're actually kind of helping the machines that could be viewing your website to actually know what is what, to know that the header is a header, to know that the nav is nav, and so forth. And that can actually be good for accessibility reasons as well. So we could use these elements to define a page like this, and we could just say here, instead of divs, we could have like header, H1, my website rocks. And then we could have a nav, and we could have a bunch of links in the nav to the different parts of our page, like the home and the about and so forth. And then we could follow this up with, different areas like, we'll just say article here. Maybe first we'll say contact here, about here. And we could follow this up so we could have like, a section here with some content. And then we could have following that like an aside, which would be maybe for like a sidebar. So we'd have like some content here, and we have a side next. H2, we'll say it's a sidebar. We'll say some content here, and then we'd follow that up with a footer here. And on their own, these don't really make things that look like headers and footers. We'd have to use some CSS to start styling these things that way. But the idea is that if we structured our website with these things, then any computer program that's reading it knows that's a header, that's a nav, that's a footer. And that's good for, like I said, one thing in particular is accessibility. So I could modify the footer. I could start to make this look like a footer. I could say padding 10 pixels, and I could say background color gray. And now this would, start to look like a footer down here, and I have to keep styling the rest of it. But this is another key way to specify things. And if you can, try to use these things instead of divs for that accessibility reason. All right, so that's an introduction to some ideas in CSS and HTML that we'll use to make website layouts.